The Rats in the Walls by H P Lovecraft was supposedly inspired by the sound of wallpaper crackling at night. But The Rats in the Walls is also a quote from Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. The story is about a wealthy American who, after the death of his son just after World War I, heads to England, to where he has restored his family estate, much to the horrors of the locals. In part 1, we learn of Delapore, his son's tragic passing, and the horrific history of Exham Priory. If you want to hear more, please click like. Subscribing, clicking the bell, and then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labours. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile, but a shell-like ruin. Yet, because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when a tragedy of intensity, hideous, though largely explained, nature had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants, and driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror the 3rd son, my lineal progenitor, and the only survivor of the abhorred line. With this sole heir denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient evidence from his sight and memory, Walter Delapore, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as Delapore. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though latter allotted to the estates of the Norreys family, and much studied because of its peculiar composite architecture. An architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation was in turn of a still earlier order or blend of orders, Roman and even Druidic or native Cymric, if legends speak truly. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of a precipice from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Anchester. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine this strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. They had hated it hundreds of years before when my ancestors lived there. They hated it now with the moss and mould of abandonment on it. I had not been a day in Anchester before I knew I came from an accursed house. And this week, workmen have blown up Exham Priory and are busy obliterating the traces of its foundations. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud. Of details, however, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delapores. Unlike our planter neighbours, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes, nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories we cherished were those archived since the migration, the glories of proud and honourable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial, Virginia line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in that incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. I can recall that fire today, as I saw it then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the women screaming, and the blacks howling and praying. My father was in the army, defending Richmond, and after many formalities, my mother and I were passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I ever knew what our hereditary envelope had contained, and as I merged into the greyness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in the mysteries which evidently lurked far back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exham Priory to its moss, bats and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me, or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was this boy who reversed the order of family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently, the Delapores had a colourful and perhaps sinister history. For a friend of my son's, Captain Edward Norreys of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Anchester and related some peasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wildness and incredibility. Norreys himself, of course, did not take them seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to my transatlantic heritage and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat, which Norreys shewed to Alfred in its picturesque desertation, and offered to get for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans for restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, having even placed my business under the direction of partners. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, a retired manufacturer, no longer young, I resolved to divest my remaining years with my new possession. Visiting Manchester in December, I was entertained by Captain Norreys, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide the coming restoration. Exham Priory itself I saw without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins covered with lichens and honeycomb and rooks' nests, perched perilously upon a precipice and denuded of floors or other interior features, save the stone wall of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestor left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, for Manchester villagers had almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside labourers, causing numerous desertations. Whilst its scope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family, my son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visit because he was a Delapore. And now I found myself suitably ostracised for a like reason, until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then, they sullenly disliked me, so that I had to collect most of the village traditions through the mediation of Norreys. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that I had come to restore a symbol so abhorrent to them, for rationality or not, they viewed Exham Priory as nothing less than the haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which Norreys collected for me, and supplementing them with accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exham Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidical or anti-druidical thing, which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. That indescribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and there were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into Cybele worship, which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div, Ops, Magna, Mat, sign of the Magna Mater, whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Ancestor had been a camp of the 3rd Augustan Legion, as many remains attest, and it was said that the Temple of Cybele was splendid and thronged with worshippers who performed nameless ceremonies at the bidding of a Phrygian priest. Tales added that the fall of the old religion did not end the orgies at the temple, but that the priests lived on in the new faith without real change. Likewise, it was said that the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to what remained of the temple and gave it the essential outline it subsequently preserved, making it the centre of a cult feared through half the Heptarchy. About 1000 AD, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory, housing a strange and powerful monastic order, surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though after the Norman conquest it must have declined tremendously, since there was no impediment when Henry III granted the site to my ancestor, Gilbert Delapore, 1st Baron of Exham, in 1261. Of my family, before this date, there is no evil report, but something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle, there is a reference to a Delapore as cursed of God in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up on the foundations of the old temple and priory. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, and the ghastlier because of their frightened reticence and cloudy evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons, besides whom Giles de Retz and the Marquis de Sade would seem as veriest tyros, and hinted whisperingly at the responsibility for the occasional disappearance of villagers through several generations. The worst characters apparently were the barons and their direct heirs. At least most was whispered about these. If of healthier inclinations, it was said an heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for a more typical scion. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house, and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament rather than ancestry was evidently the basis of this cult, for it was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor from Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the 5th Baron, became a favourite bane of children all over the countryside, and the demon heroine of a particularly horrible old ballad, not yet extinct near the Welsh border. Preserved in balladry too, though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary Delapore, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both of the slayers being absolved and blessed by the priests to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typical as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their persistence and their application to so long a line of my ancestors were especially annoying, whilst the imputations of monstrous habits proved unpleasantly reminiscent of the one known scandal of my immediate forebears, the case of my cousin, young Randolph Delapore of Carfax, who went among the natives and became a voodoo priest after he returned from the Mexican War. I was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and howlings in the barren, windswept valley beneath the limestone cliff, of the graveyard stretches after the spring rains, of the floundering, squealing white things on which Sir John Clave's horse had trod one night in a lonely field, and of the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the priory in the full light of day. These things were hackneyed spectral lore, and I was at that time a pronounced skeptic. The accounts of the vanished peasants were less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in view of medieval custom. Prying curiosity meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly shown on the bastions, now effaced around Exham Priory. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque and made me wish I had learnt more of comparative mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of bat-winged devils kept witches' Sabbath each night at the Priory, a legion whose sustenance might explain the disproportionate abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in the vast gardens. And most vivid of all, there was the dramatic epic of the rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion, the lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Around that unforgettable rodent army, a whole separate cycle of myth revolves, for it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion, with an elderly obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. It must not be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychological environment. On the other hand, I was certainly praised and encouraged by Captain Norreys and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. When the task was done, over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms, wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of restoration. Every attribute of the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I would reside here permanently and prove that a Delapore, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name, need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact, although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and the old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which later species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, Blackie, was 7 years old and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I'd accumulated while living with Captain Norreys' family during the restoration of the Priory. For 5 days, our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data. I had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and the flight of Walter Delapore, which I conceived to be the probable contents in the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appeared that my ancestor was accused with much reason of having killed all the other members of his household, except 4 servant confederates, in their sleep about 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanour, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one save perhaps the servants who assisted him and afterwards fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers, and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honoured, unharmed and undisguised to Virginia. The general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of an immemorial curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible, I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter Delapore must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity? He was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia, he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoken of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honour and delicacy. So ends part 1 of The Rats in the Walls. Though not directly tied to the mythos, there are mentions and links to many other stories, and to much of Lovecraft's other work. Let me know in the comments what you spot and what links you find. It would be interesting for everyone. In part 2, Delapore starts to hear the rats in the walls and determines to find their sources. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. But always be aware when looking into the past. There is no guarantee you will like what you find.